Good afternoon. My name is Ahmed Ismail Samatar, and I'm Dean of International Studies and Programming at Macalester College. And it's my privilege to welcome all of you, especially our long-distance traveling authors and eminent guests, to this first annual Macalester International Roundtable, at the beginning of the making of a new ritual for our college. It's also with particular appreciation that I acknowledge the support and presence of faculty colleagues, students, and staff who together are most critical to the success of projects like this. And for the students in particular, this is your college, this is your time, this is your future in the making. When, from the distance of last autumn, we first imagined the idea of the International Roundtable, I was immediately excited about the adventure, but equally intimidated by the immense logistical and managerial difficulties it could entail. Consequently, it was with a strange mixture of relish and great trepidation that I became party to this project. And now that we are on the verge of consummation, I want the community to know about one of our own who has been most significant in the invention of the idea, as well as the subsequent and continuous labor towards completion, Professor Anne Sutherland. Anne is a model of professionalism and collegiality. Her commitment to Macalester College manifested itself in numerous ways, including relentless resistance to any narrowing of the horizons and innovation of our glorious ambition to create one of the finest colleges in the United States. But many other citizens of Macalester College have contributed to the preparation of this roundtable. While I cannot name everyone, I will be remiss if I do not publicly register the precious work of a few indispensable individuals. Mary Vincent Franco, our program assistant, joined us in June and immediately put to impressive use her summa cum laude knowledge of international studies and international experience. Professor Sutherland and I know how fortunate we are to have Mary as our chief of operations. As you say in America, she doesn't miss a beat. From the development office, we are immensely indebted to Arlene Laraquest, coordinator for donor relations and special events. A woman of refined sensibilities, Arlene turned our haphazard and aesthetically suspect wishes into an elegant and yet unobtrusive design of activities. And from college relations, our gratitude goes to Nancy Peterson and Kim David. Together, they guided our unseasoned attempts to publicize the idea and then print it in this final copy of the program. Finally, I want to thank as well as introduce our president, Dr. Robert M. Gavin, Jr. As a scientist, Dr. Gavin is aware of the fact that one of the beginning yet seminal concerns of a great liberal education is a persistent engagement with what has been called our strangeness in the world and the universe at large. This attitude brings an admirable degree of humility and sincerity to his style. Further, Bob realizes that this is an exceptional time at Macalester College, a time pregnant with new and marvelous possibilities. At the levels of both intellectual interest and high aspirations for the college, we at International Studies and Programming continue to benefit greatly from Dr. Gavin's leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, the president of Macalester College, Dr. Robert M. Gavin, Jr.
Thank you, Ahmed. It's a pleasure for me to be standing here now and welcoming everyone to our first of what will be an annual conference, our International Roundtable. I, too, would like to express my appreciation to everyone involved in the planning and the execution of this roundtable, and especially welcome our guests who are on campus who will be providing the speeches, the discussion, and really challenging us. Macalester has a long tradition of emphasizing international perspective as part of what we define as academic excellence. We feel an academically excellent institution must be one that's fully engaged with the globe, and that we ought to be training persons who are going to be global citizens. I can't think of a better way to support that theme than the International Roundtable, which has been put together for this year, and which will become a regular fixture at this institution. We were fortunate to begin this year with an opening convocation on an international theme. We had hoped that the person we honored at that opening convocation would also be able to be with us today, but unfortunately the press of business prevented him from doing so. We opened the year with our convocation at which the trustees present their award for meritorious and distinguished service to a person who exemplifies the traditions of the college. This year, Macalester alumnus Kofi Annan, class of 1961, was presented the award. As most of you know, Kofi is Undersecretary General in charge of peacekeeping operations at the United Nations. Kofi in his life exemplifies the traditions we talk about, the traditions of excellence, the traditions of commitment to learning, the traditions of commitment to being a global citizen, and most especially he was honored for his commitment to the concept of peace. Kofi's schedule brought him from this campus to New York, then quickly to Somalia, and dealing with a number of issues in Somalia, and then to Rwanda and to the neighboring refugee camps in Zaire. And over the last few weeks, he's had a very exhausting schedule. But he did call me this morning, and he said that he wished to say two things, or wished that I would say two things on his behalf. The first is that he wishes he could be here, that he is very excited about the speakers who are going to be taking part in this roundtable. He knows it's a very distinguished group of speakers, and he's also very excited about the opportunity, or was very excited about the opportunity of again taking part in faculty-student dialogue on these issues. The second thing he wanted to say was that he was especially pleased that his close friend, Sir Brian Urquhart, was going to speak this afternoon, and he asked me to say, Brian, sorry he isn't here. During his acceptance of the award at the opening convocation, Kofi Annan made a statement which I think aptly describes what we're attempting to accomplish here as an institution, and I would like to quote from that. Kofi said, 30 years before the end of apartheid, a decade before the civil rights movement in this country, there was a celebration of diversity throughout this student body unlike any other I have known. Macalester's academic excellence was deeply rooted in a reverence and respect for other cultures. Students from a wide range of backgrounds and nationalities lived, worked, and grew together. We were not merely greeted with tolerance, we were welcomed with warmth. And in that tradition, I would like to welcome everyone and turn to Professor Samatar to make the introduction.
Thank you, President Gavin. Despite an ancient pedigree, rare are the times and institutions when and where cosmopolitan universalism of learning continuously challenges, if not supersedes, nativism, nationalism, and other forms of parochiality. Historical antecedents of places and contexts in which wayfaring learners from different civilizations come together to pursue great ideas and interrogate great issues range from Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, the Persia of the Sassanids and Gondoshpor, India's of Dasguptas, the golden times of Confucius in China, the Muslim world of Baghdad and Cordoba, the late medieval universities of Bologna and Paris, and West Africa's Guinea and Timbuktu. Macalester College heritage and contemporary self-definition qualifies it to partake and perhaps lead a much needed and genuine revival of the spirit of what used to be called studium generale, or in my own language, transnationalist liberal education in the face of the beckoning complexities. We at International Studies and Macalester College think that the central paradox of our age and well beyond is best captured by the simultaneity of integration and disintegration so characteristic of the processes of globalization. In the case of the first, that is to say integration, the African writer Sheikh Hamidou Kani wrote in 1963, and I quote, "Every hour that passes brings a supplement of ignition to the crucible in which the world is being fused. We have not had the same past, you and ourselves, but we shall have strictly the same future. The era of separate destinies has run its course," end of quote. But there is a downside to the process of globalization. That's fragmentation. And Jacques Attali announced rather quickly in the midst of the early 90s utopia and celebration that, quote Attali, "The new world order will not put an end to history. It will not be a utopia, harmonious and placid. Indeed, conflict is more likely now that the Cold War has ended and the market has triumphed," end of quote. Challenges of this kind are energy for a worthwhile intellectual curiosity and activity. For despite inherent and immense difficulties, a paradox, in the words of Søren Kierkegaard, and I quote, "is the source of a thinker's passion. The thinker without a paradox is like a lover without feeling, a paltry mediocrity," end of quote. Our eminent keynote speaker has dealt with many paradoxes during his long and distinguished career as an international civil servant. He comes to us today to offer his meditations on the general paradox that's the topic of the first Macalester International Roundtable. Sir Brian Urquhart has been a scholar in residence in the International Affairs Program of the Ford Foundation since 1986. Born in Dorset, in England in 1919, Sir Brian Urquhart was educated at Westminster School and Christ Church, Oxford University. During the last war, he served in the British Army in infantry and airborne units in North Africa, Sicily, and Europe. Witness to the making of the United Nations, Sir Brian Urquhart became, from 1946 to 1949, the personal assistant of Trygve Lie, the first Secretary General of the United Nations. Later, as a member of the Office of the Undersecretary General for Special Political Affairs, Dr. Ralph Bunche, he served in various capacities. And in 1957, Sir Brian served as the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Preparatory Commission of the International Atomic Energy Agency. In the early 1960s, he served as an assistant to the Secretary General's Special Representative in the Congo, where in 1960-61-62, he was appointed as the United Nations representative in Katanga, what used to be called at that time the Congo. Later, as the director in the Office of the Undersecretary General for Special Political Affairs, Sir Brian Urquhart was involved, among other questions, with peacekeeping operations in Cyprus, Jammu and Kashmir, and the Middle East. On February 1974, he assumed the office of Undersecretary General for Political Affairs. His main functions were the direction of peacekeeping forces in the Middle East and Cyprus, and negotiations relating to Namibian settlement. After 41 years of remarkable international service and attaining one of the highest appointments in the United Nations Secretariat, Sir Brian Urquhart retired in February 1986. As an author, our keynote speaker has written 7 books, including Hammarskjöld, a biography of the second Secretary General of the United Nations that came out in 1972, A Life in Peace and War, Memoirs, 1987, A World in Need of Leadership, Tomorrow's United Nations, 1990, Ralph Bunche, An American Life in 1993, and in 1994, Renewing the United Nations System. It seems to me only fitting that the world citizen who witnessed and participated in some of the great events in the making of our own contemporary epoch should grace this occasion for Macalester College. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Brian Urquhart.
Thank you so much. President Gavin, Dr. Samatar, thank you so much for your words of welcome. I must confess that your very warm words of welcome made me sound as if I was about 107 years old, but I'll try to dispel that impression during these remarks. I feel very, very honored to have been asked to give the keynote address to this round table, and particularly one with such an admirable title as the International Community and the Emerging World, possibly Disorder. This, I think, starts us off on a very positive, very solid, but also mildly skeptical note. And it's really an excellent topic, and I think a very good way of introducing it. Political systems, particularly in the 20th century, have tended to invent comforting forms of words to cover their purposes, and sometimes also to cover their shortcomings. In this country, for example, to name just 3, we have the New Deal, the New Frontier, the Great Society, and so on, and they have their counterparts in all over the world. And they represent, I think, the interplay between rhetoric and reality, which is really the stuff of politics. But I think no such form of words has been quite so comprehensive, and indeed so overworked, as the phrase the international community, which is the subject of your round table. When they need to cover an uncertain situation, or when a government's foreign policy is being questioned, or when practical involvement in some foreign situation is politically unpopular at home, or when it is necessary to show that your government is not all alone in doing something that its constituency thinks isn't a very good idea, or perhaps also when the appearance of action is needed but the reality of action has to be avoided, or generally when no one really has much idea what on earth is actually going on. Then political leaders all over the world invoke the international community. Its alleged will, its Olympian sounding cadence, its splendidly vague intentions, and its purported actions. And what a godsend that phrase is. In fact, the other day, before the operation in Haiti, I heard the Vice President in a 4-minute television address on Haiti use the phrase international community 7 times. This was before they decided quite what they were going to do. Of course, the reality of an international community is rather more elusive. And it's particularly elusive when you consider what the characteristics of a community are normally understood to be. And I think they're quite simple. The first basic characteristic of a community, as normally understood, is that it has accepted rules of conduct for its members and has effective institutions, more or less, to put those rules of conduct into effect. A community has common responsibility for all of its members, no matter what their situation, and finally, a community normally has a shared view of the future. Of course, any community, whether it's a small or a large one, doesn't spring into being immediately. It is the result of gradually developing different parts of itself, of practical experiments, of making precedents, and so on. And nowhere is that going to be truer than in developing the international community. How does the United Nations, which is the framework of the international community which politicians so often invoke, how does it measure up to these rather simple criteria? Or perhaps to put it in an even simpler way, how has the World Organization lived up to the description of it which Dag Hammarskjöld gave more than 35 years ago? He called the United Nations, and I quote, "a venture in progress towards an international community living in peace under laws of justice." I think that's as good and as simple objective as we are likely to get. But to answer the question of how the United Nations is doing as the framework of a world community, I think requires a quick look at the 50-year history of the United Nations. When the United Nations was set up in 1945, its primary purpose, which is very much reflected in its charter, was to avoid the recurrence of the disasters of the 1920s and the 1930s, which finally led to World War II. And those, roughly speaking, were economic depression and collapse, fascism or various forms of totalitarianism, the arms race, aggression, and finally war. And then the Charter added some more or less new elements. The first was economic and social development for all. The second was human rights, decolonization as an objective, and at that time a quite long-term objective of the United Nations, and the progressive development of international law. Of course, the founders at San Francisco in 1945 didn't foresee a great number of things, quite apart from the Cold War, which surprisingly enough they didn't foresee. They did not foresee, for example, a world which would shortly have no empires for the first time in recorded history. The United Nations originally had 50 members. As a result of the abolition of empires, it now has 184, with some more still to come. When the United Nations building was designed in 1947, the specifications given to the architects were for a maximum of 75 member states. And as I say, we now have 184. I think this is a very good example of the difficulty of foreseeing major political developments in the future. I don't think anybody at San Francisco foresaw that the population of the world would double in less than 50 years, as it has. They certainly didn't foresee a world of instant communications of all kinds, as well as a whole series of other technological breakthroughs. In 1945, the general view was that governments had the power and the control of most developments. And that was a very wartime view, because in wartime, governments do control or fail to control almost everything that happens. But in peacetime, it's not true. And certainly in the 50 years that have elapsed, governments have to an extraordinary extent lost their power and their control over the major forces that shape life on this planet. And of course, a concomitant of that loss of control is the growth of the private sector, all the way from international capital markets to the enormous proliferation of non-governmental organizations, which now have a very, very large effect in shaping opinion and sometimes even getting things done. In San Francisco, they certainly didn't anticipate that a number of states would actually fail. In fact, they were largely interested in how many new states would be created. They did not anticipate the growing threat to the environment, our life support system, or the possibility that common resources, which had hitherto been taken for granted, would be threatened, including water, air, and food. But I think, looking back on it, that the greatest difference between 1945 and 1994 is one of attitude and mood. In 1945, although the world had just been through 6 years of World War and most countries in the world were half destroyed and economically almost without life, there was a huge optimism about the future. And I think this stemmed to quite a considerable extent from the leadership of President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1919 and had attended the Versailles Conference in 1919, which was the peace conference after World War I. And he'd been deeply impressed at the total lack of preparation of any serious kind for that conference and the more or less disastrous nature of a number of decisions it took. And he decided already in 1939, when it was clear that there was going to be a world war, that this time, all being well, that the peace would not simply be a haphazard process. And in fact, what was called post-war planning in the State Department began in 1939 and was intensified in 1942 after the United States came into the war. And this was the most extraordinary venture, with a little bit of help from some of the Allies. And it resulted in a complete blueprint for the post-war world, centered around the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Bank, the Fund, and the International Trade Organization, which never came into being, and the specialized agencies of the United Nations and the regional organizations. It was a complete structure for what was confidently assumed was going to be a world that would avoid the horrible mistakes of the past. And of course, it was this great act of statesmanship and vision was going to be led by the United States. There was an extraordinary confidence, even an arrogance about this system. And all skepticism was indignantly rejected. I joined the Preparatory Commission of the United Nations in August 1945 after 6 years in the British Army. And in my adult life, I'd really never been exposed to civilians at all, particularly diplomats. And I was absolutely astonished at the complete confidence that the world was going to change totally for the better and that governments had learned the lessons of the past. And I vividly remember having expressed a little bit of skepticism on one occasion about whether the lion was really going to lie down with the lamb or not in the future, and getting the most tremendous rebuke from Alger Hiss, who was the Secretary General of the San Francisco Conference, and was not having any young fellow come in and say that the world was conceivably not going to be better organized and a better place. This mood of confidence and optimism lasted, in fact, for just under 1 year. And then a mixture of the Cold War and business as usual took over, greatly to the regret of those of us who had come to believe, and I still do believe it myself, that the approach taken in the United Nations Charter was the right one. But it's, to me at any rate, it's a painful thing to contrast the mood in 1945 with the situation at present. After all, we have relative good fortune, particularly in our part of the world. There is no real threat to international peace anywhere at the minute. And yet there is an extraordinarily sour and uncertain mood about the future, and particularly about international organization. There is a feeling of bewilderment and anxiety, an extraordinary lack of confidence, which is shown in lack of confidence in governments, in international organizations, in what leaders there are. And there's also, I think, an almost unprecedented lack of direction and leadership, particularly on the international scene. Governments are extremely cautious and reluctant to join in great endeavors. There is an almost studied aversion to long-term projects, and that's true both nationally and internationally. In fact, sometimes the horizon seems to be the next election, not something else. Can you imagine, for example, trying to get the Marshall Plan through the United States Congress today? A huge plan costing a great deal of money, which the results could not possibly be guaranteed, even supposing that people necessarily thought they were important. This was one of the most important initiatives ever undertaken in history by any government. I don't think you could get it through now. Of course, also, unlike 1945, there is no blueprint for the post-Cold War world. So in a sense, we're out to sea in rather stormy conditions without a chart, and sometimes I also think without a compass. One of the results of this curious situation is that more and more the media seem to make most of the running in politics. And they certainly have an enormous influence on action that is taken, or indeed action that is not taken. As I said, and it was true in the 1930s also, disastrously, governments were extremely averse to trying to get into violent and conflicting situations before they actually were forced to do so. And the result is that we tend to involve ourselves under media pressure far too late and far too weakly in critical situations. There is an extraordinary desire, well, perhaps it's not extraordinary, but there is an extraordinary reluctance to allow soldiers to take any risks. And that is not just the United States, and I'm glad to see it's beginning to be commented on here, but it's also true in other countries. There is a great reluctance to pay for international programs and international organization. And that is particularly true of the United Nations. It's, I think, worth noting that there's a rather curious situation here, because you would think to hear some people in the Congress, and indeed in other countries as well, talk about the budget of the United Nations, that it was a huge and totally unwarranted drain on the resources of the member states. When we were writing this book, which Dr. Samita mentioned, the Renewing the United Nations, we looked at the budget of the entire UN system, which is all the specialized agencies except the bank and the fund, which are financed differently, and the United Nations itself, and all the peacekeeping and humanitarian relief operations. Comes to about $10.5 billion. If you prorate that on the population of the world, it comes out to about $2 a head. Arms expenditures last year come out to $150 a head. Now, there's something very odd about these two figures. I mean, nobody seems to worry very much about arms expenditures, but everybody's always beefing about the other. I am the first to say the UN needs desperately to be reorganized. It certainly does. But the relative expenditures are very, it seemed to me, are very striking. The peacekeeping budget of the United Nations accounts for $1 for every $1,100 that the governments of the world spend on national defense. And yet the peacekeepers are the ones who seem to be under fire in most places. I think that these are figures that one really needs to stress a little to see how very little governments wish to invest in what in 1945 was supposed to be the option for a good future for everybody. There is also a considerable unwillingness to make any significant effort to strengthen and empower the United Nations. And yet there is an irresistible urge to dump on it insoluble problems, emergencies, and things like the disaster in Rwanda, for example, which nobody can think what on earth to do about. Of course, as always, the UN has always been an extremely useful scapegoat in international affairs, and that's perfectly all right, provided people understand what is happening. And it's also been a very good fig leaf to conceal the unwillingness or the inability of governments to act. We have an absolutely classic case of that at the moment in what is going on in Bosnia, where we have a great deal of breathing fire and carrying on in the media and in various parliamentary assemblies around the world. We have a UN peacekeeping force which is extremely small and has not either the mandate or the capacity to engage in full-scale war, even supposing it was a good idea. And yet you would think in some extraordinary way that it really would have been quite easy to do something different. I think this is a very striking use of the World Organization, but not necessarily one which is going to encourage its proper development. And for all these reasons, the great renaissance of the United Nations, which people very unwisely began to celebrate 5 years ago, has now turned into a great disillusionment, just as the great dream of 1945 in 2 or 3 years turned into a great disillusionment then. Now, we have to do something about this, not least because we know perfectly well, when we think about it, that if you have developed an interdependent world with instant communications, a world which has huge human problems and the capacity for ever greater disasters, which cannot be ignored, you really have to take some kind of action. And I think we also know that the future of the human race, certainly the large part of it at any rate, in decent conditions, in all probability depends on tackling these so-called global problems. Poverty, population, environment, the economy, order, and so on. And we know perfectly well what we have to get together on: peace, economic activity, pollution, climate change, disease, weapons, desertification, maintaining diversity, terrorism, famine, recession, the preservation of scarce but essential resources, drugs, crime. One can go on forever with the list. These are all things that governments can't anymore handle on their own, even the most powerful ones. And the question that constantly arises in my mind, as I observe now from the outside the United Nations and the so-called international community, is what on earth we are waiting for. I think in order to raise one's spirits a bit, it's just worth looking at where the great blueprint, the UN, has come along the road from its 1945 identity as an association of sovereign states towards the goal of the world community that Dag Hammarskjöld spoke of 30 years ago. Because it is the tradition, the transition from the association of equal sovereign states and all the limitations that that implies to the institutions of a world community which people would like to have but doesn't yet exist, which is what we're in now, and it is, I think, quite a considerable part of the great tribulations at the moment of the United Nations. It is in a very choppy transitional state. And the question really is whether you can bring the whole apparatus through successfully or not. The UN was set up to deal primarily with conflicts between states and to stay out of internal conflicts. Now its main function in the peace and security side is dealing with civil and ethnic conflict within states or within the territory of failed states. And the public and the media, I think quite rightly, particularly due to the very emotional impact of television, see the UN more and more as the public service sector, the police and the rescue service and everything else, of an embryonic world community, and therefore they deplore, again quite rightly, its shortcomings in fulfilling this role. But governments, on the other hand, I don't think do see the UN in this light, and they are very reluctant to give it either the capacity or the mandate to carry out these tasks. I think one of the questions which I hope somebody will address in the 50th anniversary next year will be whether the governments really wish to empower their international organization, not only to deal with conflict and human disaster, but also to begin to make a reasonably effective stab at tackling the major economic and social issues which we all recognize. the root problems and sources of instability. Let us look again at the three very simple criteria I mentioned at the beginning for community and see how the UN stacks up. Accepted rules and institutions, common responsibility for all its members, and a shared view of the future. Well, rules and institutions. There are certainly lots of sort of rules, most of them not particularly binding. There's the Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a great family of human rights conventions. There is an enormous proliferation of international conventions and treaties. More international law has been promulgated in the last 45 years than in the whole of the rest of recorded history, including some monumental achievements like the Law of the Sea Treaty. There are Security Council resolutions coming out at an astonishing pace now that the Security Council has suddenly discovered that it can agree on important matters. And some of those resolutions, theoretically at any rate, are legally binding. There is a great deal of rhetoric about international law, but really not very much system. There is extraordinarily little monitoring of international law, though that is beginning to come about to some extent. And there is almost no enforcement. If you want to look at how difficult the enforcement of international law in practice really would be, it's worth taking a look at the post-Desert Storm efforts over Iraq and the great resolution of the United Nations which set the terms for the end of the war with Iraq, which included a number of things, including getting rid of all the Iraq's weapons of mass destruction and a whole series of other things. This has taken the combined efforts of a great number of governments and a very, very highly qualified UN commission now ever since the end of Desert Storm. It's coming along, but it is an immensely complex process just to do that in one small series of subjects in one country. So it's not easy to monitor, let alone enforce international law. But I think there are some other straws in the wind here. I like to think, for example, that the United States operation in Haiti is one such straw in the wind. After all, the basis of the operation in Haiti, in my book at any rate, is, in the first place, a whole series of decisions by the Security Council. The fact that, unlike most elections, the election in Haiti, which brought President Aristide to power, was monitored and guaranteed by the United Nations, which is very unusual. And, of course, there is a massive human rights problem as well. I think there are other straws in the wind. The war crimes commissions on Bosnia and now Rwanda. They don't work very well. They are under great attack, most recently on 60 Minutes. Though I think it doesn't seem to have occurred to Mike Wallace that in that program, I don't know whether any of you saw it, that it's one thing to have people up for war crimes after a war is finished, but if they happen to be a part of a fighting army in a war which is still going on, it's rather more difficult. In any case, I think that the intention is there, as it was in human rights in 1948, and that it's something you have to build on. There is an extraordinary arrangement in El Salvador. The peace in El Salvador is I think one of the least looked at and one of the most striking successes of a UN mediator. Certainly in recent years, it's an extremely imaginative settlement, and actually, most of the part, it's working. That includes a number of extraordinary elements, including a commission on the truth to try to put on the table all of the horrors which have bedeviled the history of El Salvador for many, many years. And also, with the agreement of the government of El Salvador, it includes an international human rights monitoring apparatus, something that no other government has accepted. There are also, of course, calls for a UN criminal court, even a human rights court. And it seems to me that these are all small steps towards a much more effective regime of international law. They're very small steps, but they are steps. We have a very long way to go towards a real system. As far as institutions are concerned, community institutions, I suppose you could say that in the peace and security area, which gets much the most attention anyway because it's dramatic, the Security Council is now working pretty much as it was intended to work. Or at least it goes that far as agreeing on what ought to be done. Its problem is that it can't implement its decisions more often than not. And if it doesn't give reality to its decisions, it really becomes like the Wizard of Oz. It's just giving out great pronouncements with absolutely no real meaning. And I think this is the major problem of the Security Council. To give effect to its decisions, it has a number of possibilities, apart from the diplomatic and mediating possibilities. It has peacekeeping, which worked extremely well in conflicts between states, but is a very limited technique because it requires people actually to want to stop fighting, and therefore doesn't work so well when you're dealing with civil or ethnic conflict. It has proved possible, if the circumstances are right, for the United Nations to give its blessing to major enforcement actions like Desert Storm, in which it delegates a major military action to a member or a group of members. But there's a huge gray area in between peacekeeping and enforcement where there is no convincing capacity yet to deal with the problems at hand, civil and ethnic violence on a very large scale. There isn't even an agreement on responsibility for doing something about this. And in fact, as I said before, action is usually dictated much too late by public pressure and the media. There is much talk now about preventive action. It sounds great. It's obviously much cheaper and much more efficient to prevent something from happening than to have to deal with it when it does happen. But there are tremendous obstacles in the way of preventive action, very largely obstacles of motivation and of human psychology and of politics. I won't go into those now. That's a whole separate subject. There are no rules at the moment for dealing with states that fail, which means you have to improvise very unsatisfactorily. And I think it best to remember in our part of the world that there is a very widespread aversion in very large parts of the world to international intervention. That is, until it's much too late, in which case intervention is asked for. But it is extremely difficult to persuade a great number of governments around the world that it would be a good idea if something was done to head off trouble instead of asking for help when it's already happened. And of course, matching that is an increasing reluctance on the part of governments to provide the means of intervention, particularly troops. If you want to see that in classic form, you want to read Presidential Directive 25, which is the Clinton administration's Bible on the United States participation in UN peacekeeping, in which all of the problems of national security interests, safety of the troops, command, and so on are trotted out, ending up in a kind of sort of spellbinding dilemma at the end. It's not very encouraging. I was interested to hear the justifications of the operation in Haiti, which seemed to me to be almost entirely beside the point. Of course, Haiti isn't necessarily a matter of national security for the United States, and you have to really stretch it to try to prove that it is. What it is a perfectly serious international responsibility in which a lot of other people feel that there is a responsibility. I was surprised that more wasn't said about that. It seems to be, for a country which is the world's leader, it's a rather important factor. And the truth is that there is no community without common responsibility. So we have to come to terms with that before we start talking too much about the international community. As to peace enforcement experiments, which are the new thing, they haven't worked out too well. They really have. This is supposed to be a more forceful way of dealing with the gray area of civil conflict and violence. I don't think that the experiences in either Bosnia or Somalia are very encouraging, even though they may have and probably have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And I think we're going to have to really try to work out a far more confident response to these situations, which people really accept. And of course, no one knows how to cope with genocide, or indeed how to foresee the events which trigger genocide or trigger civil violence. Nobody could foresee the shooting down of the 2 presidents which triggered the ghastly goings-on in Rwanda. Nobody could foresee the Rodney King verdict either. And I think that there has to be a really much more studied approach to the problems which the UN is now largely involved in before it can really improve its performance. In addition to that, its capacity to do something useful is really incredibly inadequate. The UN has until very recently, had no infrastructure at all for field operations. It had no contingency planning capacity. It had no training capacity, so it never knows what the state of the troops it's going to put in the field are. It had no logistics of any permanent kind and no reserve funds to finance emergency operations. All UN operations start from scratch and usually on a shoestring. And in fact, I think that it's an absolute miracle, and I'm sorry Kofi Annan isn't here because he's the person who's responsible now for all this. I think it's a miracle that with the 18 operations they have in the field, they have managed to keep going. There is no defense ministry in the world that I know of which would dream of putting its soldiers into the field with the total lack of capacity and infrastructure which the UN has. It's a great gamble, particularly for the soldiers. It's worked so far, mostly, but I think it's something that really desperately needs to be looked into. And worst of all, the UN is dependent for action entirely on its member states, both for troops and financial and other support. And as governments become more reluctant to face the uncertainties of disaster, the delays in deploying UN operations in the field are becoming longer and longer. It took 6 months to get 500 Pakistani soldiers to Mogadishu. It took the whole summer to get anybody to Rwanda. And you could duplicate that criticism 20 times. There is no capacity in the UN for immediate deployment. If you want to see how serious that is, just think of a community whose police force couldn't send people to the scene of the crime for weeks and even months. How much credit and respect would it have from its constituents? How much credibility would it have? And of course, the UN tends to go into violent situations without any kind of protection. I suppose the classic case in point was the Harlan County, the ship which was going to take the monitors and trainers to start the whole transition process in Haiti last October. And I think if it had managed to land, the whole course of events in Haiti would probably have been very different. It was seen off by a, I thought, not very convincing looking demonstration on the dock. And any small group of people trained in that kind of thing could have very easily handled that demonstration perfectly easily. There was unfortunately nobody at hand to do that. So that the lack of this sort of capacity is very serious in terms of results. I have advocated that the UN simply must now have its own quite small, highly trained volunteer force, its own people immediately available and highly trained both in dealing with violence and also in the skills of peacekeeping and local negotiation. If you could get people of that kind with a good reputation in very early in a conflict situation, it is possible, before great numbers of people have been killed, to cool it down enough to try to get the leaders of the different factions together to stop the disaster that is impending. At the moment, we don't have any way of doing that. The objections to a UN volunteer force are, I think, really because it would change the identity of the UN. It would become, in that case, a working organization in its own right to some extent, and I don't think governments are ready for that. The objections which are made to it, incidentally, are almost identical with the objections to the proposal of Sir Robert Peel in the United Kingdom in the 1830s for a national police force. He was laughed out of court for suggesting this on the grounds that it will give the central authority too much power, that it would interfere with local arrangements, that the police would be mercenaries, and that it would cost too much. And yet, 35 years later, the British police force was one of the main pillars of the state and was the model for national police forces all over the world. So I like to think that maybe something the same will happen in the UN. I'm not so sure. I'm going to have to cut a bit here. I was going to talk about economic and social matters, but I really won't, except to say that we're very behindhand in any serious international machinery to look at the problems which we have to solve. If we don't develop a gross instability in the world, it is a terrible statistic, and I'll only give one, that of the world's 5.6 billion population, 1.4 billion are below the poverty level, and more are added every year, so the proportion increases. Obviously, this is a field where an enormous rethinking has to be done. As far as common responsibility for all its members are concerned, I've really dealt with that already. I think, thanks to the media and to non-governmental organizations and to public opinion and to the television particularly, this is coming along. As I said before, politicians are very reluctant about a general international responsibility. But I think that any positive vision of the world of the future demands the acceptance of responsibility worldwide. A shared view of the future, and I will finish with that. People say that it's impossible to get different societies and different civilizations and different peoples really to share a view of the future, but I don't think this is really true. I think it's much simpler than that. Basically, what I believe is true is this. We have now, for the first time in history, extremely impressive projections of what is likely to happen to our planet, even to our civilization, if some of the present trends continue. And I think that here the industrialized world, which we're all lucky enough to live in, does have a particular responsibility. And it has to, because we, after all, created a great number of the forces which were supposed to be benign, some of which have turned out not to be benign, and which have accelerated the course of events on this planet to a really unbelievable degree in 50 years. I think there are two options. One is to protect our advantages, to hole up in our nice, comfortable societies, to worry about our diminishing numbers in relation to the rest of the world, which is also quite striking, to consume ourselves to death, and to try to keep the vast majority of the less fortunate out of our private, privileged paradise. And if that is the choice, then you can forget about world community, except as a rhetorical device, and you can let the international framework, the UN, muddle on just as damage control, last resort safety net, dumping ground for impossible problems, and a place for letting off steam, and also, as I said before, as a very useful scapegoat and fig leaf. But there's another option, which is like our predecessors in 1945, we could aspire to make a success of the future. And if we were to do that, we could get out and lead all of the efforts in all of the different areas of human activity which we know we have to make. We could try to really set the course on the main problems which we know we have to tackle if the future is not to be a disaster. Of course, this will take all our ingenuity and energy and experience and a lot of resources, and it's a very, very long haul indeed. But of course it also ought to be fun, and at least it would remove the sort of couch potato feeling that life has got rather dull, not to mention the end of history and all that. If that were to be the chosen option, then the UN system, renewed, streamlined, reorganized, reinvigorated, could still provide a framework for what I think would be the grandest of human ventures, which would be to cooperate in making the future a success, or as Dag Hammarskjöld put it, to create a world community under laws of justice. Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Great pleasure. Yeah. I can't hear anything, but you'll translate.
If you want to come to the microphones that are available, Sir Brian Urquhart is ready to take some questions. So please do so. Break the ice.
Yes, I just was fortunate to be able to attend a session of the World Academy of Science that just took place in Minneapolis, and there were 3 reports on the UN commissions and activities. The first one was, that they touched on, was the Cairo conference, but then some of the people may have heard it was on the radio. There was a commission on the food, peace and food, by a person named Swaminathan, a UN commission, and another commission on global governance by a person named Sridhar Ramphal. And I was wondering if you were familiar with these. They both seemed, by the way, they both called for a standing army. They both called for streamlining and revitalizing. And actually, both were quite strong on human rights and taking this leadership. I guess my question is, I'm sure you're aware of these commissions. I guess the food and peace is not going to actually be officially released until next. Global governance?
No, the other one.
Peace and food? Peace and food, it's Swaminathan. Yeah, they seem to be kind of connected somehow. But I was wondering if you're aware of it, and is your pitch here today, is that to promote those kinds of changes, or is it to say that maybe they're not really straws in the wind, or they're not really out there? You know?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I am indeed aware of them. In fact, I'm a member of 2 of them, the Global Governance Commission, and then there's a group which the Ford Foundation is doing with Yale University at the request of the Secretary General Boutros-Ghali, which is called the Next 50 Years of the United Nations. And then there's a third group, which I'm sorry to say I'm also a member of, which is the Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, which the Carnegie Corporation is sponsoring. There are quite a lot of these things. Of course, the Cairo conference is an official conference of the UN. And I should have said while I was talking, except that I was beginning to feel that it was going on too long, that I think one of the unique things which has been done in the past 20 years is to have these so-called global conferences, which the press tend to make fun of. But in fact, what they do is to alert people all over the world to the nature of some of our major problems, like the environment or population or women's rights or things like that. And they also produce a wonderful interaction between governments, who are usually rather sticky on these matters, and the non-governmental world, which is becoming increasingly active. And I think the Cairo conference was a very interesting case in point. It seems to me that it did put people's thinking considerably forward on a number of issues. The Commission on Global Governance, the Prevention of Deadly Conflict Commission, and the Yale Ford Group are non-UN efforts to try to feed into the UN for its 50th anniversary some ideas as to how to make the whole thing work better, and also to try to look at how you do develop a huge political institution like the United Nations in a way which is relevant to what is actually happening in the world. I don't know how successful they'll be in doing this. The UN is probably the most reformed institution in history. It's had 8 major reform moves in 45 years, which is a lot. But the funny thing is that they've mostly really come to very little. And what we're trying to do in some of these is to inject what we think, they're not necessarily new ideas, but they're more relevant political ideas as to how you would allow the governments in the UN to get a hold on some of these problems which have escaped them. I don't think one should underestimate what has been done in the past 50 years under some very unfavorable conditions, and the Cold War was certainly a very unfavorable climate in which to do anything. If you think, for example, that decolonization in 1945 was supposed to take 70 or 100 years and in fact took place in under 20, it's quite a remarkable fact. If you think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when it was adopted in 1948, was regarded with the utmost cynicism by most governments, and people made terrible remarks about how it was just, it was paying lip service to Eleanor Roosevelt and things like that. Well, you can't say that human rights is exactly a business which can be ignored by anybody now. There are massive violations of human rights, but in fact, thanks to the Declaration and to the work of the non-governmental organizations trying to put it into effect, this has become a major force in not only in national life, but in international relations. So that I think that one has to see that we have moved quite a long way. What I think we haven't moved towards, and what the commissions you mentioned are going to try to help with, is a kind of slightly more synthesizing of the various ideas and the various things that have been achieved into a system which would sort of support itself. So that, you would have things more or less moving in the same direction in a sort of coordinated way. Now, whether we shall succeed, I'm not so sure. It's worth trying.
Yes, your invocation of Robert Peel tempts me to make another historical parallel, that to the Articles of Confederation, which preceded the U.S. Constitution. Couldn't it be that the United Nations' inability to develop autonomy from nation states is because it is a creature of those nation states, and the rules that govern it were the rules that they wrote, and that perhaps it's time to consider replacing that charter with one that would guarantee the United Nations more autonomy?
Well, I think it's always beguiling to think that you could improve on the UN Charter, and in principle it's probably true, but in fact I don't think it is. Again, President Roosevelt insisted on the San Francisco Conference taking place before the end of the war. And he did that because the Versailles Conference took place in 1919, a year after the war had ended. And one of the things that struck Roosevelt was that most of the people there had already forgotten the lessons of the war. And the San Francisco Conference produced a charter which I don't think you would have a hope of producing today. So I think it's very important to try to preserve that, given that there are some parts of it which need to be updated, or some things even need to be taken out, but not really anything really terribly important. As regards the nation-state, as I said, the nation-state is not what it used to be, nor is national sovereignty either. But it's still the building block we have to try to organize international society, or one of the main building blocks, in fact, the principal one. And therefore, I think what one needs to look for is a sort of progression based on the nation-state to infinitely better international arrangements. And if you think of it, it's what's always happened. I mean, human institutions have traditionally moved to a larger sphere when it was clear that the existing institution couldn't handle the problems. So you went from the tribe to the village to the town to the county to the province to the state and so on, in some parts of the world to confederations of states. And in the world now we've got a whole series of problems which even that can't handle, which we know perfectly well. I gave just a very sort of partial list of them. So that I think what one needs to do, using the nation-state as the building block, is to try to build up institutions, preferably not very large, which can effectively bring together the efforts of states in different fields, and also to present the rules and the norms by which they're going to have to behave if we're going to make it into the end of the next century, which seems to me sometimes to be quite questionable. And I think that's a better way to go. I don't see how you can really radically change the nature of the Charter without throwing away something that's extremely valuable. But I mean, a lot of people don't agree with that.
I'd like to hark back to something you said towards the beginning of your speech when you spoke of the fundamental changes the UN has undergone since the Charter was written. And I'd also like to speak, as you recall what you said about the fact that many of the traditional empires of the world have disintegrated, as what we have is more than 3 times as many members as we originally had. You also spoke the need to change some of the relationships within the UN. I'd like to ask a specific question. If you believe the function and form of the Security Council should be changed to recognize this new reality, seeing as how the Security Council membership right now is currently made up of 4 European powers and a very, very large East Asian power that do seem to represent many of the traditional empires of the world. And if you think that the Security Council's function should be changed in response to the changing global environment.
Well, I'm very glad you raised that question. It's now a very popular subject, the restructuring of the Security Council. Of course, the Security Council is out of date because it represents, in fact, the world of 1945, the 5 permanent members being the 5 leaders of the victorious alliance during the war. And it's long overdue for a change. There are a lot of difficulties, however. I think the least of them is that at least 2 of the permanent members are no longer world powers, Britain and France. And it would make much more sense if their permanent membership became instead the permanent membership for the European community. But of course, Britain and France have the veto, so it's catch-22 really, because they can stop that. And I can tell you, any suggestion of this kind goes over very badly in London and Paris. I've made it a number of times. But I don't think that's really the problem. The problem is to try to get the Council more representative, have more legitimacy, while at the same time preserving a sufficiently small size for it to be able to act, which it is actually, as an emergency organization. And there are various means of doing this which have been discussed at enormous length in the UN and outside it. One of them would be to simply add 5 more permanent members, which would be Japan and Germany, which qualify on economic grounds, and then 3 so-called regional superpowers from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. That sounds great until you look at who the 3 regional superpowers are, and then you get into a mare's nest. I mean, in Latin America, there's a very complicated situation between Brazil and Argentina. In Africa, you have Nigeria, apparently at the moment almost disintegrating, and also a feeling by Egypt that Egypt is an African superpower. And then in India, you have at least 3 countries, which are, by any standards, very powerful countries, India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. So it's not so easy. And for that reason, this whole process has rather slowed down. It was confidently expected this would be settled next year in the 50th anniversary year, but a lot of people say it now won't be. I'm sure it will happen eventually. I think, meanwhile, there's a great number of things the Security Council could do. There is a certain arrogance among the permanent members, and especially among the sort of Western 3. They do tend to take matters into their own hands, claiming that it's an emergency and therefore you have to act fast. There's an extraordinary lack of consultation on important matters quite often, even with other members of the Council, let alone governments outside. For example, remember when they adopted mandatory sanctions on Iraq in late 1990. They did this at a meeting at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was visited by one ambassador whose main agricultural trading partner was Iraq, who said, you know, it's really very embarrassing for me to read about this in the New York Times because it would have been nice to have had a bit of warning. And there is very little. I think they have to consult much more with other governments. They have to have their proceedings far more transparent than they are at the minute, because most of the actual work of the Council takes place in a closed room with no record. And these are things that I think would allay the feeling in quite a large part of the world that the Council is a kind of great power conspiracy run by the United States. And I think before they restructure the Council, which they're obviously going to have to do, they can do a lot of things to make things better. Then, of course, there's a veto. The trouble with the veto is that it really doesn't make much sense, except that it was the condition on which both the United States and the Soviet Union joined the United Nations in the first place. And I very much doubt if you abolished the veto, whether the Congress would not feel rather strongly that the United States didn't belong in the United Nations. I think the best you can hope for with the veto is to try to get an agreement to modify it so that it only applies to decisions affecting the use of military force. I very much doubt if that will work, but it's worth trying. There's a long way to go on the Security Council, but you're right. Since it's the most prominent part of the UN and the one that people hear most about, it is extremely important to update it and make its procedures more relevant to what is happening.
It would seem that a number of the problems which you outlined as us facing in the coming years, including the environmental problems, the severe poverty, I think perhaps many of the internal conflicts within countries are rooted in very severe economic inequalities and very severe economic problems. At the same time, I believe one of the trends we've witnessed over the last 75 to 50 years is the emergence of a number of very large transnational corporations whose size and wealth really supersede the nation state. Yet, at the same time, it seems that as a body which has the capability to shape the international community and shape the future, the UN, in the way it was constructed after World War II and with the construction of the Bretton Woods institutions, really has very little control over international economic policy or international economic issues. And I'm wondering how it is you see that the UN will be capable of being a vehicle to tackle these problems without having control over the international economic issues and without the ability to effectively redistribute wealth and confront some of the issues of poverty that you discussed.
Well, I'm delighted you asked that question because I cut out 3 pages of my notes in order to spare you going on for another 4 hours on this subject, and it's an extremely important subject, and it's one, incidentally, that I'm totally unqualified to really talk about, but that would never stop me and won't stop me now. In these various groups that you were talking about, the Global Governance Commission and the Ford-Yale group and some of the others, we have tried to address this problem. And in fact, in the Ford-Yale group, I insisted that the American representative be from the private sector and not one of the usual suspects from the public sector. And we have, in fact, Felix Rohatyn, who is a sort of merchant banker of considerable repute. And it's very interesting to see how someone like that reacts to the problems of the international organization and the UN in particular. Because more and more, I think, people in the private sector, in the big corporations and so on, are becoming also extremely alarmed at the lack of control which they, in their turn, have over some of the things that are happening, particularly the flow of money, which they weren't prepared for. And so they have actually a huge vested interest in trying to develop a much more relevant international system with a certain amount of regulations and rules in order to make the world safe for the kind of things they do. And I think this is basically a very encouraging development. The question is how you do it, because it's no secret that power goes where the money is. The UN has no money except for the development program for economic matters. The bank and the fund dispose of enormous quantities of money. And they have really shifted off very much to being a separate entity. They have a different method of financing. They don't really come to UN meetings very much. And they have been traditionally thought to be in control of the economic sector. I think this was a huge mistake and will not really work very well anymore. Partly because the function of the bank is now very much lessened by the fact that most developing countries can get a better deal in the open market. And partly because the Bretton Woods system inevitably has been seen, at any rate, to be very much an institution of the industrialized world, sort of handing it out to the developing world. And this has created a good deal of, well, you know much more about this than I do, but it's a very interesting phenomenon. We have suggested in at least 2 of these bodies that I'm on, or will suggest, that some effort be made to try to bring back into the UN framework, so that everybody can have a voice, some important aspect of whatever you call it, macroeconomic policy making. I don't really believe there's any such thing as a macroeconomic policy, but nonetheless, to have a really equitably constituted group which would really look at the economic situation in the world and really try to figure out ways that it can be addressed in a much more equitable way. That inevitably would affect the bank and the fund. I think that you could now very probably bring in the private sector at an extremely high level. I mean, the people you're talking about, the transnational corporations, because they too have an enormous stake now in economic order. They are not these great robber barons with nothing to fear. They are a lot of them extremely nervous. And I think that somebody much cleverer than me ought to be able to devise an organizational way in which you can begin to reflect these new phenomena. But it's an extremely important subject. I mean, it couldn't be more important, because if you have not only a growing proportion of the world population below the poverty level, but also because partly of technology and partly for bad administration and corruption and goodness knows 100 other causes, you have countries which are falling further and further behind, which are never going to get on the train again at this rate. I think you have to face it. And I think it's the most important thing to be discussed, actually, because anybody can figure out how to improve the Security Council. It's relatively easy, provided governments want to do it. But to really produce a new economic doctrine which encompasses not only the economic side of the equation, but poverty, population, environment, and so on, and really makes it into something like what Keynes tried to do in 1945, I think is desperately needed. And maybe you're the one to do it. Perhaps you're the future Jean Monnet and Maynard Keynes.
In 1991, I worked as a consultant for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, and I had pleasant relations with the officers of that group and visited Italy. I worked in India. I was struck, however, by the legion inefficiency of the FAO. It's got a reputation for it. And I wondered if there were special problems with UN bureaucracies and if there's anything that you could suggest might be done about that, realizing that bureaucracy everywhere is a growing and difficult problem.
I think there is a very large problem, and it's easy to apportion blame, but it stems, apart from anything else, from the fact that the UN, with a multi-government directorate, is not so easy to run as a bureaucracy under one government. It's extremely hard to do. That's no excuse. Erskine Childers and I, in a book called A World in Need of Leadership, have suggested that almost the first thing you have to tackle here is the way the UN appoints its leaders, its senior officials, starting with the Secretary General, because it really is a scandal. It's awful, and that is something that only governments can change. Let's just take the Secretary General, for example. There is no organization in the private sector, not a corporation or a university or a hospital or a foundation, which would dream of appointing its chief executive in the way the UN appoints the Secretary General. This is a completely haphazard cocktail party, gossipy, backstage, log-rolling affair. There's no search procedure at all. Nobody goes out into the world and looks for the best possible man or woman to do this incredibly difficult job. Nobody has even tried to formulate the kind of qualities we're looking for. There is no search procedure. It's very parochial. It's a sort of old boy net. And then on top of all that, there's no interview. I mean, they literally didn't ask Boutros Ghali what he really thought about reorganization or the world economy or the function of keeping the peace or anything. Nobody asked him. He just arrived, and then to everybody's intense surprise, he had a rather idiosyncratic way of doing these things. And then, of course, they were all furious. That is not serious, and you have to change it. And to a lesser extent, it's true in the FAO and some of these other organizations. Well, I think you were there in the glorious reign of Mr. Sauma. Were you not? Yes. Well, this was a sort of romantic figure. I mean, what has happened really is that, these are sort of the feudal barons surrounding the weak central power of the United Nations, and there have been some remarkably good ones. There have also been some remarkably bad ones. The UN, I think, is very lucky to have got away with not having a total disaster. I mean, they didn't even look under W in the War Crimes Index when they appointed Waldheim. They all had it on their shelves. They didn't look at it. This is the kind of total frivolity which governments have. Childers and I suggested a rather simple formula, which was, in the first place, you'd have a single 7-year term for all these people, so they don't start politicking halfway through their term for re-election, which is a disaster and happens all the time. We also suggested a proper search procedure. We also suggested it was high time there was a woman as Secretary General, and things like that. To my absolute astonishment, after the United States had taken this idea out, this was before the last appointment of the Secretary General, it was in 1990, and the United States, in the shape of Ambassador Pickering, who was then the permanent representative, really took these proposals up and started to run with them. Ran into the most tremendous opposition, people saying, look here, old boy, I mean, you can't ask senior political figures these questions, you know, they're extremely awkward. This kind of nonsense. There's a diplomatic old boy net there, which has got to be broken sometime. I sometimes think one of the troubles with these organizations is that they're staffed mostly by diplomats. And with the best will in the world, diplomats are people who try to saw off the corners and blunt the edges and generally arrive at a sort of lowest common denominator. That is not the way you can tackle problems like poverty or population or the environment or indeed the whole complex of problems we have to tackle. So I think you're right. I think one has to, this is a very important matter that has to be tackled. And you also have to stop governments interfering in the way these organizations are staffed, because if they do that, you automatically get the Prime Minister's drunken brother-in-law instead of a real expert in the subject. I mean, it happens all the time, and it's a great mistake. And then the organization gets a bad name with some reason. I think there's a huge amount to be done. The UN has made one remarkable step forward in the last 6 months, which is something I've been advocating for about 35 years, that at long last, the United States, instead of appointing a diplomat or a former public figure as the Undersecretary General in charge of administration and management, which is the key post in the whole system for this, has at long last appointed somebody from the private sector, a former head of an extremely large private sector organization. And I must say the difference already is quite striking. This is somebody who has actually been trained in management and financial management and administration, and an enormous breath of fresh air has come into these somewhat fusty, bureaucratic channels, but I hope it'll work.
I think we will call it an evening. Thank you, Sir Brian Urquhart. Thank you, audience. The seats are hard, so it's, I think, time to go home. And thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Bye-bye.